Welcome back for the fourth Insights lecture of the year. I'm Brent Stickles. I'm a partner with Yes, and I am AIGA Minnesota's liaison to the Walker Art Center for the Insights Lecture Series. I want to say thanks to all of you guys for a really phenomenal 2018 season. Thank you for joining us here. Thank you to all of our friends and partners in the chapters and the people out there in the internet who are streaming. Hi, thank you for being here. For over 30 years, AIGA Minnesota has partnered with the Walker Art Center to present diverse, exploratory, contemporary, and very challenging, sometimes unexpected design lectures. So on behalf of AIGA Minnesota, I want to say thanks to Emmett, to the Walker team, and the whole Walker Art Center for continuing this partnership for 30 plus years. Thank you, guys. If you haven't heard me say it enough already through the series, aigaminnesota.org is where there is a whole cavalcade of events stacking up. A couple of highlights coming up on April 11th. We have an event called Step Away from the Screen. It's going to feature Sharon Werner and some other designers talking about the importance of having a side craft in addition to your professional practice. That's on April 11th. A great collaboration we're doing with the ACC, the American Craft Council. April 12th and 13th, Portfolio One-on-One. If you're a student, it's your chance to get your book reviewed by professionals, as well as workshops and lectures and a few other things. It's a great event. But if you're a pro, it's a great opportunity to see the latest crop of talent coming out. We need volunteer reviewers, so check out the website. There's solopreneurs events, there's networking events, Cocktails with Creatives is coming up. Design camp information is starting to trickle out. So aigaminnesota.org, your source for everything AIGA Minnesota. But tonight, we've got a really, really good one. So please welcome Design Director from the Walker Art Center, Mr. Emmett Byrne, who will tell you all about it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. And thanks to those of you who have come to all 4 lectures. I think it's been a really amazing year, and it wouldn't have happened without you guys, so thank you so much. I need to thank AIGA Minnesota, of course. You heard about it, but it's a partnership that's been going on for over 30 years, which is kind of amazing. One of the longest partnerships at the Walker Art Center. So thank you, everybody in the audience from the AIGA. I need to thank really quickly Shapco Printing, who donates the printing of our posters every year. They're a really valuable partner. And then I just want to remind everybody during the Q&A session, please raise your hands and an usher will bring a microphone to you so we can capture your question for online audiences. Oh, and I also want to mention, we again are going to try, this totally failed last week, but we're going to try to get the speaker up to the lobby to talk to everybody who wants to talk to him instead of having people come down here and talk to him while he's on the stage. So we're going to rush him out through the green room. It's not going to work like it didn't work last week, but it's fine. So tonight's speaker, Paul Soulellis. God, I really tried hard with that. I've been saying his name wrong for like a month now. Paul Soulellis explores the fertile landscape that exists between printed media and digital technology. And through the act of shifting seamlessly between the two, he frequently reveals new truths about both. As a designer, an artist, a publisher, and an educator, his interests manifest in a wide range of ideas which he researches and generates around, often through his own self-initiated projects such as the Library of the Printed Web, which features the work of more than 180 contemporary artists and was acquired by the MoMA in 2013. He also has a project called The Download, which he'll talk about tonight, which is a collection of artist commissions that Paul curates for Rhode, which is one of the premier institutions for digital art. Paul also runs his design studio Counterpractice, which tackles design and branding projects for clients such as the Rockefeller Foundation, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Cornell University, and the TEDx Conferences. He is a professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he teaches graphic design and experimental publishing, and he has been a visiting lecturer at many schools, including Parsons, Pratt, Art Center College of Design, and many others. He has completed artist residencies around the world in places such as Italy, Iceland, and England, and he is a graduate of Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. He has won awards for book design, photography, and poster design, and his work was profiled in The New Yorker. So I'm super happy to welcome to the stage Paul Soulellis.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Emmett, for that introduction. And I'm really honored to be here on this stage. I want to thank also AIGA Minnesota and the Walker for the invitation. This is a series that I've watched and followed for a long time, and I've had many friends and colleagues who have been up here on this stage through the years, so joining you right now feels very special. The title of my talk tonight is Urgent Archives. And before we get started, I want to shout out to all my friends and family who are watching on the live stream. There's a whole RISD crew gathered at the design office in Providence, so I'm so happy that they're tuned in. And get this, there is also something called a Crossing Streams viewing party that's happening right now in New York City at 31 XXXI in New York City, which some of you may know is the US base for Grilly Type. And they've got 2 screens going. They're simultaneously streaming us, plus the Miami Heat game that's going on right now, versus the Cavs, which I don't know anything about. So I think, but it must be important, and I think that's just hilarious. I hope they mute the game or not. I don't know how that's going to work. Speaking of Miami, I was there a few months ago. I was a visiting artist at Art Center, South Florida. I did a residency there, which was kind of a dream. It was a chance to clear some time and space outside of teaching graphic design at RISD and to devote myself to my own work for a month. I had been asking a lot of questions about my practice during the last year, so I was really fortunate to have a dedicated studio and a brief change of scenery for some inspiration. This is the incredible table they gave me for my desk. I made a deal with myself that I would use this residency to make new work, something that would move my practice forward in a different way. So when I spoke with Emmett, I said, a few months ago, I said, you know, this talk would be the perfect place to launch a new project. Why don't I use insights as a kind of deadline? Like many of you, I'm sure I really need deadlines to work. So that's exactly what I've done. I'm launching a new project tonight here. I'm going to begin by telling you a bit about where I'm coming from and how I've built my practice through the years, which is focused on experimental publishing. And then in the second half, I'll share this new project with you. So I'm actually going to start by taking you to Italy. This is last summer. I was there to co-teach a workshop. I was in a small town on the island of Sicily. And this was a tiny village where I was, about an hour from Palermo, and it's called Salemi. And it happens to be the home for 55,000 VHS tapes and DVDs that were shipped there when the legendary Kim's Video closed down in New York City about 10 years ago. And that's quite a story in itself, how this archive traveled from St. Mark's Place in Manhattan to the other side of the planet. And I'm not really going to get into that here, but you can read all about it on the web. It involves the mafia. It's bizarre. It's a really great story. But let's just say that this was an excellent place to bring students to think about archives and to make work about how we consume and save and savor cultural artifacts, and what we do with our stories across time and space. I had been invited by Elisa Giardina Papa, you see her on the left there, an artist and a friend who I've worked with before. When we arrived, all of us were kind of stunned to find that this collection of 20th century legacy media, unique recordings, rare tapes, bootlegs, one-of-a-kind compilations, that this really wasn't an archive at all, but just piles and piles of stuff in disarray, totally out of control. Some of it was moldy, I think you can see the mold there, and sitting in direct sunlight. And thousands of DVDs had actually disappeared through the years. This was a scary scene, a kind of archivist's nightmare, actually. But we were completely intrigued, nonetheless, and I thought, sometimes we really do just fail. These things that we think are so important to preserve sometimes just fade away, or we forget about them, and they disappear. Most of the time, you don't hear about it again or bother to take a second look. So there we were taking a second look. And sometimes I think there's real value in coming back to examine the thing that's failed, to find the beauty and the deeper meaning in what's been forgotten. And while I was there, I became obsessed with these. I searched through all of the piles, looking only for the hand-drawn, the hand-collaged, the handwritten covers, the totally analog, ad hoc video tape labels that were drawn by Kim's employees through the late 80s and 90s. Totally lost now, not accessible, not digitized, basically gone. But here we were looking again, and I quickly pulled these shots together, seeing something in these displaced artifacts, stuck here in this tiny village, a different story about work and culture and media at the end of the 20th century that had somehow escaped us. One evening, Eliza and I sat outside here on these steps. We were getting ready to give a double talk together in a few days to the students and the other faculty and to people from town. We were both writing our talks. And I love writing like that, working in physical space with someone else, together, but still by yourself, working in silence. We were staying right here in this place next to these ancient steps, climbing down through the town at the base of a castle. And as we were writing, the wind was blowing through the passageway there, and there was the sound of birds, and Elisa put on a Laurie Anderson song. And I've decided to start this talk by telling you about that moment because something pivotal happened there while I was writing that talk in Salemi, Italy. Something that caused me to reconsider my practice and to think about a new way of working that I want to share with you tonight. So I'm going to come back to that, I promise, in just a bit. But first, how did I get to this turning point in Salemi, thinking about archives? So here's some backstory. About 8 years ago, I started to realize that client work was taking its toll on me. I had been running my own business for a long time, and I was getting burned out. Here's the kind of work I was doing when I just honestly couldn't take it anymore. Brand guidelines and corporate identity standards, projects about mission statements and business plans that really had nothing to do with me, but I was doing my best and I was successful. And I did this for about 20 years. And I'm not going to talk about any of this work tonight. Some of it was good, some of it really wasn't, but it was always about selling. Design that promotes a product or an image or a mission. Sometimes I would agree with that agenda, but often I didn't. And after a while, I just got so tired of selling. So I started making my own work in the form of artists' books. I liked artists' books because they somehow seemed lighter and more open, somehow free of that pressure to sell. When I started, I didn't even sell the books themselves. They didn't circulate. They were one-off print projects that became a place for me to work something out, separate from my client work. I kept them really far apart, in fact. I used the form of the book as a container for ideas. And I guess I did have an agenda. I was slowly starting to build an art practice. But these weren't branding projects. They weren't about promoting myself. This was a way to work to slow things down. To consider the form of the book and the printed page, a way to share ideas. The books were social. And what do I mean by that? Well, ever since I can remember, I've never felt like I fit in. Community has always been important to me, but at the same time, a slippery concept. Growing up, I always felt like I was on the outside of things, out of place. When I came out in 1986, at the height of the AIDS crisis, I felt like I was on the outside of just about everything and terrified. So I learned how to make my own place, to be fiercely independent. I studied architecture in school, but I rejected any sense of building early on. And my thesis was actually a series of large drawings of a haunted house that I imagined in an abandoned town. Somehow, even back then, I knew that I was never really going to be an architect. And for those first 5 years after school, I really struggled to understand where I belong. I'm a self-taught graphic designer, and that happened right there in the mid-90s, working at big design firms, doing projects for Coca-Cola Japan and Celebrity Cruises, where I dared myself to do things when I had no clue. Somehow they gave me that permission, and I'm grateful for that. When I look back on that stuff, and I'm not showing any of it here, I cringe because a lot of it wasn't that great. But I was constantly doing and failing and building on that, and using my curiosity to move on to the next thing. And honestly, that's exactly what I teach my students today at RISD. So this way of working stayed with me for a while. I guess it's still with me, trying to fit in, never fitting in, learning, and moving on. And I guess at some point I stopped calling it an identity crisis and started thinking of it as my identity. So I want to tell you about the project where I learned that books could be social. It's called Weymouths, and it was a commission for an arts festival, the London 2012 Cultural Olympiad, which happened during the Olympics. I made 12 books about Weymouth, England, and Weymouth, Massachusetts, and all of these connections and disconnects between these two random places. I created a strange typeface for the project called Stetson, based on a fragment of lettering that I found in a shed in Massachusetts. You can actually download it for free on my website, if you dare. I don't know who would use it. Some people have. And I filled these books with photographs and stories that I found online, and conversations with people who I drew into the project. And what I proposed was that the 12 volumes would be given away on the streets of Weymouth, England during the Olympics. This was the town where the sailing games were taking place, so I knew it was going to be absolutely packed with tourists and spectators. And this is how I proposed to do it: a bicycle, a basket, a book blanket, and I would just give away 20 copies of each volume in public, one edition a day for 12 days. I'd stay outside with this setup each day until all of the books were gone. And that's pretty much what happened. It was a daunting experience, really tough and humbling, because I didn't know what I was doing, riding this bike around, the books sometimes falling out, looking for places to set up, being told to leave, dealing with weather, but also just wondering, what the hell am I doing here? It was the first time that I did anything performative like this in public. And I had this opportunity to ask myself some serious questions about public space and the value of art and print, and what it means to engage with strangers around your work. I wasn't even thinking in terms of publishing yet, but it was the first time that I participated in the circulation of my own work. And what I found was that for some people, the book was just an excuse to have a conversation. As I moved around town, I was meeting people and talking about the project, and the books moved between people. Some real magic happened. All of it really unexpected on my part. People started looking for me and collecting the books, giving them to each other, as well as giving things back to me. And by the end of the 12 days, there were stories and relationships and connections between me and every person who had engaged with the project. At the very end, this woman came to the bakery where I had all of the books set up, a bakery at the center of town, and she carefully went through every single one. And when she was done, she thanked me for creating this powerful social network, as she put it. And she wasn't talking about Facebook. So I was hooked. This ability to create a world around an act of publishing, to draw people in, and to see something form in real time in the circulation of real material objects, printed books, this was thrilling for me. So I did a few more of these site-specific projects. This one was in a small fishing village in North Iceland titled 530. And it was a 530-page book about the town, population 530. And I produced 50 copies and left them all there with the people who appear in the work. And then I did one on the island of Portland in England. This was a month-long residency in a one-room public library on the island, where I produced a community newspaper around this experience. All of the elderly people and the children who came to the library brought their stories and artifacts, and I got to photograph them, and we distributed 3,000 copies around the island. So for a period of time, I saw myself diving into places and communities of people, and then leaving, doing projects about place, but never really belonging to these places. And this was draining, emotionally and physically. And I decided to take a break for a while, as satisfying as this work was, from this type of site-specific work. But these projects taught me two very important things: that making public was a powerful way to grow, to give value to my work, and that publishing could be an artistic practice. Soon after that, I heard about a group of artists making print-on-demand books called ABC, Artists Books Cooperative, and they heard about me, and the next thing I knew, I was a member. This was another new community for me, but this time it was based online, because all of our members were scattered around the world, but we would meet up at art book fairs. And I was just so intrigued because most of these ABC artists were making printed books using material from the internet. They were engaging with network culture. There was Mishka Henner, who had recently made Dutch Landscapes, which was a series of images taken from Google Maps where the Dutch government had censored particular locations by pixelating them. And there was Joachim Schmidt, the founder of ABC. He's an established artist based in Berlin who only works with found photography. This is his Other People's Photographs, where he accumulated a massive collection of images from Flickr, all taken by strangers. He grouped them into categories, and he published them as a new vernacular of digital photography. So when I joined, ABC was finishing up ABC Ed, a project based on Ed Ruscha's books. Everyone picked one of the Ruscha classics and did a riff on it and came up with a one-word title that ended in Ed. So we had freed, scarred, peed, yellowed, exploded, collected. And the entire set of 22 books would be printed on demand and boxed up for Ruscha's 75th birthday. I had just a couple of days to quickly put something together, so I chose my favorite work of his, Every Building on the Sunset Strip. And here's what I did. I Googled the word sunset, took the first 66 image results, and adapted them to the design of the original work, stripped of color and detail and context. And all of the names of the JPEGs that I found became a kind of found poem. So my book was called Stripped, 66 Sunsets Stripped. This was my first web-to-print work. And it got a bit of attention, mostly because Ed Ruscha himself really liked the project and put the whole set in a show at the Gagosian Gallery in New York City. So we suddenly found ourselves in the middle of this intense art world scene for about a minute, but it was tremendous. And this kind of opened up a whole new practice for me, mining the web for material. We took the project to the New York Art Book Fair, and I looked around and found so many other artists working this way with network material. So I started collecting some of these projects, and in 2013, I got an opportunity to show them all together as a collection. I had Clement Vala's postcards from Google Earth, and David Horvitz's portraits of sad, depressed people, all taken from stock photo websites. And this funny book by Chris Alexander, an archive of thousands of tweets containing the word McNugget. There's a lot of crazy stuff in this collection. All in all, about 50 artists' works that I wheeled around in this wooden box that I made, and I called it Library of the Printed Web. And there was so much interest in this collection, so I decided to keep it going, and it grew, and I continued to curate and to collect. All around a very simple idea: network culture articulated as print artifact. My interest was in artists who were asking questions about materiality and slowing down the web, and concepts like authorship and aura and accessibility. Here's the original Tumblr that I started. So Library of the Printed Web became a whole new way for me to think about community and books as social objects. I was reaching out to these artists and getting to know them, and they started seeking me out to send me their work. I started packing it up and taking it on the road, giving talks about it, carrying books all around. And I even published a kind of manifesto called Search, Compile, Publish, which I distributed in an edition of 500 for free at the New York Art Book Fair. The collection grew to include printed spam, a mug printed with declassified NSA documents, a zine of Richard Prince's stolen Instagrams, and dozens of works that raised crucial questions about copyright, image production, and artistic practice in the 21st century. All of the work I collected for Library of the Printed Web had been produced in the span of just a few years. And I would identify that period roughly from about 2008 to 2015 as post-iPhone and pre-Trump. And I think that's significant. It was the time when the network began to get personal, but at the same time becoming more corporate. It was asking us for our trust in new ways, traveling with us, revealing itself in more and more surprising places. It was the time of the new aesthetic, a term coined by artist James Bridle around 2012. He said, "It's a way of seeing that seemed to reveal a blurring between the real and the digital, the physical and the virtual, the human and the machine." It was also the beginning of total network saturation. Artists and designers were learning to perform their work in truly networked space. We began to carry the browser around with us all day and to sleep beside it at night. So what did it mean to now see it on paper? How does screen-based work change when printed? The relationship between web page and printed page became less and less fixed, and Library of the Printed Web became my way to perform and celebrate this slippery condition. So for the next 5 years, I used Library of the Printed Web to build my own artist's practice. But I wanted to take the curatorial part of this project even further, and I thought, why not present new work from these artists? Many of them had become friends, and I was doing studio visits on a regular basis. And first I considered actually starting a gallery, but then I was inspired by Seth Siegelob, who had recently passed away, and how he had used the form of the book itself to stage exhibitions. And he did this famously in 1968 with the Xerox book. Each of these 7 artists got 25 pages for their work. That was their real estate they were given, and each submission would be photocopied 1,000 times and bound into a book. This was a group show in the form of an edition of 1,000 books that would circulate without any need for a physical gallery space. The publication was the show. That's Carl Andre's work there. So I decided to do the same. For Printed Web #1, I designed it so that each artist got 6 pages to stage their web-to-print work. Penelope Umbrico put together these incredible images of tablet replacement screens, and Joachim Schmidt found these Polaroids of Polaroids on eBay. This first issue contained work from these 10 artists, a kind of appropriation dream team, I think, and a text by Hito Steyero. And I printed it with Newspaper Club, a print-on-demand newsprint service I had found, as an edition of 1,000 copies. And it launched at the LA Art Book Fair in January 2014. It sold out, and I went on to produce 20 more Printed Web publications featuring the work of a few hundred artists. And I brought not all of these, but many of them here to give to the library here at the Walker, so you'll have access to them. Here's #2, featuring James Bridle, and #3 was an open call, and I received submissions from 150 artists. #4 was co-published with Charlotte Cotton at ICP in New York. And number 5 was an anthology of bots that I launched last year. Each of these was an experiment in print on demand, so I changed the format each time. And I also did some great one-on-one collaborations with artists like Molly Soda and her YouTube channel, and Raphael Rosendahl, who published his abstract browsing Chrome extension as a 72-page zine. So last year, Library of the Printed Web was acquired by MoMA Library in New York. The entire project, including all of the works I had collected, but also everything I had published. And before delivering the collection to them, I made this catalog of the entire thing. It's got every artifact, all of the details, and includes some really good texts that were written especially for the book. And MoMA did this incredible thing. They gave the collection its own call number designation, LPW, so that all 250 works can stay together on the shelves and be easily researched as a single project. So I'm kind of ecstatic now, knowing that I can just send people to West 54th Street in New York to study the collection instead of carrying these books around, and that it's most importantly, it's being properly preserved and cared for by real librarians. And that for many of the artists in the collection, this move was maybe the only way their work could enter MoMA Library. And it's remarkable to me that this homegrown archive, this small project that I started, now works to fill in a small corner in the history of artistic publishing, and that it'll hopefully stay there doing that work well beyond my lifetime. But now that I've got some distance, I'm starting to see the project differently. It's been absorbed into this ultimate archive, placed into a deeper timeline. Today, artists and designers work in and around the internet by default. It's connected to everything that we do. The printed web is no longer a new condition or even an unusual one. So now that it's at MoMA, it's pointing back in time, not forward, back to a very particular way of working at the start of the 21st century. I once tried to identify each of the artists in Library of the Printed Web by defining these web-to-print techniques: grabbing images and text, hunting for anomalies, scraping websites for data, and performing digital material into new contexts. These are nothing new. These are basic appropriation tactics that have been in use for over 100 years. But if we want to understand how artists work in cut and paste culture today, we need to go further. We need to look deeper into our digital archives at the power dynamics that flow in and out of these platforms. Who profits when work is taken? What are the politics of appropriation? So, as promised, back to Salemi, Italy, last summer. That talk that I was writing, that would be the first time that I was speaking about Library of the Printed Web publicly since the MoMA acquisition, which, by the way, happened just a few days after Trump's inauguration. So I'm sitting there outside next to Elisa, and as I'm setting up the talk, I get to the word grabbing, which had been essential for describing Library of the Printed Web for years. And it hit me like a brick. How could I possibly use this word to talk about my work? I was stunned. I couldn't. How come in all this time I hadn't seen this word, and many of the works in Library of the Printed Web that were explicitly about taking work made by others, how did I not see these as problematic gestures? How come it had taken me so long to see grabbing as an imperialist concept, as an aggressive expression of colonization and violence? I was embarrassed, and I panicked, because this felt like a crisis. Suddenly, post-Trump, I didn't know how to talk about my own work. This wasn't just about language. I was certain in that moment that my practice had to change. And so at that talk in Italy last summer, in front of a small audience of about 30 people, I announced a new agenda, that publishing needed to be more radical, and that my own publishing practice as an artist and as a designer needed to engage more explicitly with politics and power. I showed a new web-to-print project at that talk, a zine that I made very quickly just after Trump's inauguration. I had noticed that a lot of information had disappeared from the White House website. So I used the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine to look more closely, and I discovered that whole sections had disappeared from whitehouse.gov at 5 p.m. on January 20th, 2017, Inauguration Day. Pretty much any content related to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, LGBTQ, women, seniors, children, veterans, and people with disabilities was simply gone. You may have heard about this in the news, but it was gone pretty quickly after that. Instead, the Trump White House had replaced each page with this message: "Thank you for your interest in the subject." So this work documents an act of removal that, for the most part, had already been forgotten. So on all the left-hand pages, the original Obama content. On every right-hand page, that same URL today showing Trump's message. Or rather, a year ago, whitehouse.gov was recently totally redesigned, but all that information is still gone. How do we choose what to preserve? As artists and designers, we make these decisions every day. Any tweet, any image, any website can be considered a valuable artifact or garbage in our post-truth condition. There's an immense pressure to save and to accumulate everything, but also to select and amplify particular messages. After the last presidential election, I saw people printing tweets and carrying them high above their heads at protests. This had a huge impact on me. It's when I started to see the printed web as so much more than just a curatorial art project. Bernie Sanders brought a large printed tweet to the Senate floor during a debate on healthcare. This act of drawing from digital archives and materializing information, isolating it in an artist's book or in the newspaper or on a protest sign, serves as an interruption. It's a kind of reminder in public that at this particular moment, something was said. As rhetoric continues to explode everywhere, online and off, broadcast and consumed and circulated without restraint, materiality still seems to be one way to resist or at least slow down the narrative. Thank you for your interest in this subject felt like a small step forward for me. It showed me how I might move my practice in a new direction, how I might use appropriation as a way to interrupt power, to document what's happening around us, to take a second look as a form of resistance. And we need more ways to interrupt, I think. We have new archives now, social networks where we deposit our speech and our writing into massive banks of cultural hash, where a single post threatens to change the world and then is forgotten in an instant. We tend to our never-ending feeds with great care, and we love them like extensions of ourselves. Endless feeds and streams are accumulating into gigantic cultural archives that are impossible for most of us to understand. Instead, they lull us into a kind of passive consumption, a state of watching togetherness that Rob Horning calls the new boredom. Streamers on Twitch broadcast for days at a time to collect subscribers, chatting and watching YouTube, or doing nothing at all. Feeds and streams like these feel like a new way to produce culture, but there's a long history to this pileup of language, going back to at least the mid-19th century when printing telegraphs started pumping messages onto endless scrolls of paper. Today, the never-ending scroll continues, and there's a real crisis in our feeds, a crisis of discernment. It's become harder and harder to recognize what's real, what's true, and what's just. We're entangled in hate speech and deception and fake news. Every day, algorithmic media shows us new ways to perform publishing to more distant audiences, to more curated publics, promising new opportunities for selling and exposing and targeting. But these same tools and platforms feeding our appetite for information and entertainment are also creating the most perfect conditions for crimes of truth and misinformation. In the smooth flow of the new publishing, the substrate isn't clear. It might be invisible or even unknowable. Code written into distant servers, hidden below a natural language interface. Biased algorithms that work under the hood, writing records that remain out of sight. In the new publishing paradigm, the container, what I had previously fallen in love with when I started making books, has become open and fluid, maybe non-existent. Authorship is no longer a fixed concept. Design and voice might be disguised or unrecognizable or even non-human. Our platforms are failing us. So how do we train ourselves to engage with these new conversations and vistas? How do we learn new techniques for discerning, for authenticating, and for seeing in the space of flows? Feeds are a product of capitalism, success through accumulation. To pile up language and image is to profit in legibility and meaning. But failure goes hand in hand with capitalism too. Winners profit while others are taking a loss. Jack Halberstam, in his book, The Queer Art of Failure, says that queer studies offers us a way to imagine alternatives to hegemonic systems. He asks us to think about queer struggle as a shadow history to US capitalism, a narrative of anti-colonial struggle, the refusal of legibility, and an art of unbecoming. And I'm really inspired by this idea of the queer art of failure right now. I feel like we need serious alternatives, tactics that allow us to undo grand narratives, to resist normative discourse by looking away from conventional images of success. And that's really hard to do. But what if artists and designers could engage in our current political climate by resisting smoothness and the easy read? What if we envisioned ways of practicing art and design that don't support dominant narratives? A design politics of interruption, of imbalance, of upset. What if we saw the whistleblower and the data activist as artists and the leak as an art form? The leak moves information from private into public space, and in many cases, it works as a rupture. What do we learn from the leak? Is this perhaps the most radical kind of publishing because it actually works to disturb power? Last year's Paradise Papers tried to do this by publishing 13.4 million documents, files that can't be totally seen or known from any one position, no well-defined container, unknown sources, and instant distribution. The leak breaks the narrative. It launches and announces itself as an interruption. It cuts through the noise like a cry. One of the leak's key gestures is the download. And I'm trying to push this idea of interruption as an art form in my own practice by focusing on the act of downloading itself. The download as a technique of spreading and preserving information in the slippery context of the never-ending feed. To download is to copy, to interrupt circulation by storing a copy locally. To examine downloaded material is to leave the online space of the feed and pause the update cycle. To disperse material by making it downloadable is to preserve it, keeping it safe by taking it off the network, moving it away from the politics of corporate staging and hosting. I've been curating a series of artists' commissions called The Download for a few years now, where artists explore these ideas. I commission work that uses the computer user's desktop as a space for experiencing art, and I'm doing this at Rhizome, where I'm a contributing editor. I see the download projects as acts of counter-publishing. They're hosted by an arts institution, but once downloaded, the files are outside all of the usual conventions and economies of publishing or of the art world or the internet, for that matter. They're meant to be viewed privately, offline, in the safety of your own home. By transferring the files to your hard drive, the user is free to interact with the work in any way desired. You can open the files and move them around and create whatever viewing experience feels right, but you can also shuffle the material, remix it, print it, redistribute it, even destroy it. These projects propose a very different relationship to art. Our first download, we've done 7 so far, was with Christopher Clary, who published his porn collection, almost 2,000 images. They're presented in a very flat way, just one big folder containing all of the images for browsing however you like, but he changed the names of the JPEGs, replacing each file name with fragments of private text messages and emails between him and past lovers. And wherever a real name appeared, he replaced it with the original image name. So depending on how you sort the files, the work reads differently, like a play or a soap opera or a poem. Christopher does public readings of this work, scrolling through the files and reading the titles and then trashing the entire zip at the end. We went on to publish new work by Morrishin Alayari, Lance Wakeling, Elisa Jordina Papa, a GIF novel by Dennis Cooper, and for number 7, we published a section of El Paquete, the 1 terabyte drive of digital material that circulates offline in Cuba each week, unregulated by the government. This was a collaboration with Julia Wiest and Nestor Sire from Havana. And number 6 was by Sheda Soleimani, titled To Oblivion. I would call it an urgent archive. It's a digital lamentation for Rehana Jabari, a woman in Iran who was executed for allegedly murdering her rapist. Sheda placed the upsetting words of Rehana, written while she was in jail, directly into the folder names that lead you into the work. As you move through the folders, you encounter translated letters, execution records, and images of executed women. And at the very bottom of the folder tree is a recording of Rehana's last voicemail to her mother, and 2 high-res files of constructed images produced by Sheda. The viewer becomes a writer here, arranging the material and creating new meanings and relationships. In reassembling the material, you collaborate with the artist in a unique construction of the work. So earlier, I promised that I would reveal new work tonight. This is a new project, and it's an attempt to activate my practice with a kind of urgency, a response to our current condition. It tries to connect the dots between the book as social object, the printed web, the download, and the never-ending feed, and to extend these ideas way beyond the art world. It picks up where those protest signs and "thank you for your interest in this subject" leave off, as a way to re-see material that might otherwise disappear. It's an urgent archive that attempts to expose information crimes by performing agile acts of counter-publishing. I'm collecting and recirculating missing information in the form of digital downloads and data performance. As I mentioned earlier, I began working on this in Miami, where climate change is a sharp reality. Tidal flooding is getting so bad in Miami Beach that the city is raising many of their roads by 2 feet. And this is happening right now at a cost of many billions of dollars. These are my photos from January. And of course, there are the storms, which are more and more devastating each year. While I was there, I visited an island in the Keys that's actually a tiny Florida state park. And you can see some of the hurricane damage back there. This is a beautiful spot that's a sanctuary for birds and plant life, and there's only one park ranger stationed here who keeps watch, and she takes care of the island. And when we arrived on our boat, she was there to greet us and started showing us around. She took us on a long walk through the forest that covers most of the island alongside this mystery wall built with coral rock. She said no one knows who built it or why it's there, but it's been there for a few hundred years or maybe more. And at some point, we got to the opposite side of the island, and as we approached the water's edge, I asked her what she thought about the changes happening to the island. I meant climate change, of course. And she said something about tourism getting worse, and I thought maybe she doesn't understand or I'm not being so clear. So I said, no, I mean rising sea level. And she sort of smiled awkwardly and said, you know, as a Florida state park ranger, I'm not allowed to discuss climate change or even to say those words. I could lose my job. I'm not even allowed to Google that phrase on a state computer, she said. And I didn't know that. So I learned from her that Florida Governor Rick Scott had banned the words climate change and global warming in all official state documents and discourse from about 2015 on. And in that moment of recognition, the park ranger and I saw each other. Her guard came down, she opened up, and we talked. We talked about language and oppression. Right after that, it seemed fitting that I might turn my view towards EPA.gov, the website of the US Environmental Protection Agency. I had heard in the news, maybe you did too, that the Trump administration had removed references to climate change from the EPA website sometime last year. But I wanted to know more. How bad was it and what exactly had happened? So I did a deep dive there in Miami and found that it wasn't just a few scrubbed words, but that entire sections of the website having to do with climate change were gone. They were removed from EPA.gov on Friday, April 28th, 2017. And it was a sudden move. It all disappeared that one weekend. And the order came directly from Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA, and a Trump appointee. But determining exactly which pages had disappeared turned out to be a huge challenge for me. I was totally overwhelmed. I used the Wayback Machine again, as well as the EPA's own archive, which is impossible to navigate, to try to map out the missing pages. And I started to piece it together that among the missing material was this entire section, epa.gov/climate change, which had been online since 1997. This was one of the earliest sites about climate change ever posted to the web, evolving and deepening over time, starting in 97 with language like global warming is likely to rise the level of the sea, and then 20 years later in 2017, climate change is happening and humans are largely responsible. This section, it's an entire subdomain really, contained hundreds of pages and public documents. And that's not all. Also gone were entire sites on climate change for students, resources for state, local, and tribal governments, and whole sections on climate change science and impacts. Just like that, our public narrative representing 20 years of scientific thinking and action wiped clean. At first, I thought that I would just manually scrape all of these pages from the Internet Archive and save all of the content, the URLs, the text, the images, even the HTML code. I started to do that, but again, it was just too much. And then I discovered that someone had filed a Freedom of Information Act request last summer asking the EPA to provide a complete list of what had been removed. And they did. Legally, they have to. So there they were. Difficult to find, but right there in public view, 4 Excel spreadsheets packed with details. All of the web pages, the audio files, PDFs, Microsoft Word docs, Excel spreadsheets, and PowerPoints, exactly 1,964 files, every URL, every page title, and all of the file names removed from public view on April 28th because they referenced climate change. All of those web pages, they don't work anymore, of course. But reading through the archived URLs, fractured narratives can be found. Stories about how we struggled to do something about the biggest challenge ever facing human life on this planet. This massive deletion of web pages caused links to break all over the internet, of course. Most of the pages now redirect to this message, which was created specifically for the purge. It says, "Thank you for your interest in this topic. We're currently updating our website to reflect EPA's priorities under the leadership of President Trump and Administrator Pruitt." It's been like that for a year. And some redirect here showing Trump signing the executive order that does away with Obama's Clean Power Plan exactly 1 month before the April 28th purge. Those are just the web pages. But many of the PDFs and PowerPoints, the spreadsheets, the Word docs, and the audio files survived the purge and continued to live online. They're still there. But without any links, no one can get to them. They're totally hidden from public view. Until now. This is what I've decided to do. I am restoring our access to these links. I've created an urgent archive of removed language and active counter-publishing. It's an attempt to interrupt this grand narrative put in place by this administration by exposing all of these URLs, the documents and the files in full public view again. Thank you. Part of what I'm publishing includes 1,000 pages of emails from within the EPA detailing the exact instructions and back and forth correspondence as program managers and IT staff rushed to scrub the site on Friday night, April 28th. This treasure trove was another Freedom of Information Act request that I found, and it works like a real-time, minute-by-minute script narrating the scene. It's the language of total efficiency. The emails describe a particular culture of thoroughness and precision and a total refusal of responsibility. It's a remarkable demonstration of bureaucratic censorship at work. And I'm particularly interested in this email, which appears to be the one that sets the entire purge in motion, so much so that I've borrowed some of its language. The project that I'm launching tonight is titled Steve, Harvey, and Matt. Steve, Harvey, and Matt is less a single publication and more an act of publishing. It takes 3 forms. It's a broadcast, it's a book, and it's a download. And all of it lives at epa.archive.org. The broadcast is a continuous live stream of all of the removed assets, all of the web page titles and file names, and all of their URLs. Now, this is a live feed, which means that everyone is seeing the same broadcast at the same time, regardless of where you are on the planet or what kind of device or browser you're using. One at a time, each file projects into public space for about 6 seconds until the whole thing cycles through, almost 2,000 files 10 times a day. You can click on any link, and it opens up in a new tab. So all of those documents are resurrected now, not entirely functional, but not hidden either, asking us to take a second look, to consider what's been taken away. The dead pages are still dead, but the titles persist, sort of zombie-like, I think. They're allowed to haunt us now. You know, I suspect these links will start degrading soon as more and more files are deleted or migrated over the next few years. Or perhaps they're all going to be totally restored in the next administration. Who knows? They'll be out of date. As an act of publishing, Steve, Harvey, and Matt is a monument to futility. But I don't expect it to stay fixed in any single position. By spreading the project out on multiple platforms, the information stays alive. Part 2 contains all of the EPA emails from the weekend of April 28th, now published as a 734-page print-on-demand book. This is the title. As discussed with Nancy, we would like the content at the links below removed and archived as soon as possible. The original spreadsheets are in the book as well, and you can find it all on lulu.com. I don't even have a copy yet. It's that new. Lastly, the zip download contains everything. All of the Freedom of Information Act source files, a PDF of the books, and a note from me about the project. The whole thing is openly hosted on GitHub, so you can clone the entire site, you can rehost it, or you can do whatever you like with all the files. And I hope people do. And I'm really fortunate to have found this awesome domain name, archive.org, which could easily become a platform for more urgent archive work in the near future. But I'm also distributing Steve, Harvey, and Matt on a DAT peer-to-peer network with no centralized hosting, which means that anyone who connects to these DAT URLs, and you can ask me more about this later, it's pretty new, anybody who connects to these with a Beaker browser becomes a node on a distributed chain of access. It's a gesture away from the web's dependency on corporate services. Basically, you're hosting the files on your own computer. And my point is this: the more we allow these files to breathe, downloaded, stored, copied, distributed, the less likely we are to forget. All of this redundancy is my effort to take care of culture, to preserve language, and to keep us aware of what we're doing. So I want to conclude by asking us all to take care. Artists and designers, let's take care of our files, our networks, and ourselves. This is an open call to tend to all of our archives, our physical materials, our piles of stuff, our failures, our digital feeds and streams that we love so much. We need to see these platforms differently. Let's print them, interrupt, archive, redistribute, and inhabit them with new agendas. Let's define a new queer publishing. With the help of archivists and activists, let's defocus our gaze and look for breaches, for breaks, and leaks that resist smooth flow. Let's teach ourselves new ways to see. How else to prepare for total uncertainty? Thank you. Questions or comments? There?
Is there reason for concern for like potential repercussions for this? Are you under any sort of threat from any legal source or people responding to this?
This is the first time anyone's seeing it, so I don't know, but should I be scared? No, I really don't think so. Freedom of Information Act reports that are issued from requests. I didn't make those requests. They were made by other people. The emails were a request from, I'm forgetting the name of the nonprofit that did it. I mean, there are wholly nonprofits and NGOs who are just filing these requests in order to get information. It's all absolutely legal. It's part of how our government is supposed to work. So yeah, no, I'm not profiting from this material. It's no, I'm not worried.
Hi, I really don't have a question for you. I just wanted to say thank you. I think what you're doing is exactly what artists and designers need to be doing today. Thanks.
This is the topics that you discussed here were absolutely current for what we were discussing in the lobby, as a matter of fact, when you showed up. And I want to say that I think this expands into what all of our personal archives, what happens to them, and it's a discussion I cover again and again and again with people in our industry. What happens with everything we've amassed, and what value is it, and all of that. But and if you have something to say about that, great. My real question is, when you do this collaborative work, did it begin with a certain amount of pushback, and did you have methods for counteracting the pushback from artists who would say, "Gee, this is dangerous," or "This is too open," or whatever?
No, not really. But again, this counter-publishing work, that I'm describing here, is all pretty new. I mean, that one zine I did, and now this project tonight. That's really it. All the Library of the Printed Web work, I don't really put into this. Most of it, I don't put into this sort of category of, you know, political work or work that's trying to counter grand narratives, as I'm describing it here. So I don't know. I mean, I'm curious myself. How is this going to develop? I do feel like this is important for all of us, for any of us to take on. But in my own practice, I want to do more work like this. It's not that I want to. I feel like there's a need to. And it's also coming out of, I didn't really get into this, but this is also coming out of my own sort of personal sense of frustration with how can we be an artist or a designer in a time when we are under such threat and risk with information and with, frankly, with design, with the way things are designed when we're talking about platforms and how information gets to us and how we create and disseminate information. So I don't know. I don't know what collaborations might come out of this.
Thank you. I'll see how to phrase this, but I think I'm interested in hearing a little bit about your background was kind of from a commercial perspective, and you transitioned into, let's say, an artist. But as far as your forms of distribution now, there's a lot of like artist book fairs, independent grants, a lot of conversations, your own personal relationships. So I was curious, as far as thinking about distribution from a larger sense, you know, there's GitHub communities. They're kind of like very broad, but also very maybe small as far as the immediate circles. Ideas that you have, maybe bringing your previous perspective from a commercial perspective into kind of your new work, thinking that people that are doing advertising, people that are doing commercial work are very good at distributing and pushing things out. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting connection right there that I haven't thought much about, like sort of coming full circle, you know, which, you know, now that, I mean, this particular work has a different sort of charge around it, I think, than some of the earlier projects that I showed you, like the books in Iceland and Italy and England and all those. Where dissemination is key here. It's essential, you know, like even just showing it here to an audience of 300 people, you know, that right there is an act of putting this work out there. So how might that expand? You know, I think that's really important. This is really new to me, but the idea that work might be distributed in a way that doesn't rely on traditional, conventional, commercial activity, even corporate hosting, even things like how we get our domain names and where we store the information on an Amazon service, or how pages are crawled by Google and used in different ways. And that's what got me interested in the DAT project. I don't know if any of you have heard about it, but the DAT project, look it up. There's something called the Beaker browser. It's for free. You can download it. And it basically, I mentioned it briefly, it allows you to connect to other users with the information with your website and become a node on a network where everybody is sharing in a distributed way. I'm sure I'm not doing a great, it's not an elegant way of describing the project, but they really do have a lot of great language describing this idea, the DAT project and the Beaker browser. So I'm actually, yeah, I don't know. I want to know more about that. I want to explore these communities of people and activists and artists who are concerned with how information is being distributed and alternatives, especially on the internet, which has become so corporate. Something over there?
First off, this is amazing, really. It's really, really important for society. But when you were first creating these archives with and working with people that were like collecting selfies and everything, was this kind of like for humor, or did you actually have a purpose behind it?
That's a great question. I've never been asked it quite like that before, but I think that's a good way of putting it. You know, what was the motive or the intention, right, behind collecting? And I think you could get a sense that there is some humor in a lot of that work, not all of it, but it wasn't really that. It was more about our relationship to the network and to the internet, to network culture. And I think I mentioned this briefly, but that at this moment, and I think really particularly, I think the iPhone had something to do with it. The fact that we started carrying the browser around with us signaled the beginning of network saturation, and I feel like that was the moment when all of our relationships with the internet started to change, and that started to change how we work. That our copy and paste sort of culture of art and design really started to flourish in the early 2000s, but particularly in that period where a lot of this work was produced. And that was my motivation, was what's motivating an artist to create work like this? How is this changing our relationship to this material? In the past, collage artists or painters or sculptors would have worked with material in the world. Now our material is digital and circulating on networks. And how does that change the kind of work that we make and how we work? So what I saw in a lot of these print works in these publications was artists trying to work that out, and sometimes not so successfully, and other times in really like potent, sharp ways, and sometimes humorous ways. And also, as I mentioned, I think that's over. I feel like, it's not new anymore. It's not unusual anymore. I think we kind of figured it out.
So I'm really fascinated by your new project. I think it's absolutely wonderful and important. And as someone that is not very well versed in computers, has basically your normal, maybe traditional relationship with social media and the internet, besides perhaps sharing the project on my different networks, how do you see someone that's at this average level participating in and furthering your project?
A great question, and I think you said it. I think that's exactly it. Sharing it. I think I said at the end, I believe the power of a project like this is in spreading it, and in spreading it, however futile that gesture might be, we are working to keep the information alive and out there and public. The whole counter publishing part of this is in response to this idea that that information can be taken away from us. Of course, that happens in all different ways. It always has been happening, but right now it's happening in in significantly more dramatic ways than before, because it's so easy and because massive amounts of data and information can disappear, like that. So I feel like it's important to resist that and sort of work against that, which means keeping this information in public. Is that the end of questions? Oh, great, yeah. And there's one down here too. Two more, okay. Two more questions.
Given your suggestion that a leaker may be an artist, how do you feel specifically about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange as an artist? And does information have intrinsic value, or is its release and ebb and flow always political in nature?
Well, I think leaks work in all sorts of ways. I wasn't, I'm not trying to, I think there are good and bad ways to use information, and I think leaks are just another sort of way that information can resist whatever the grand narrative is. And so I think we're also seeing leaks working in negative ways as well. So when I mention, is the whistleblower an artist, is the leak an art form, I'm kind of saying that with it's a little tongue in cheek. How might we use the power of radically changing the status of information to our advantage? How can we, I see something in that act of information changing its state from private to public. That seems to be one of the most powerful gestures that I can imagine today as a designer or as an artist. So how can we use that? And of course, all of it is political. One more? Up there? Here?
I was wondering if you would explain exactly what you mean by the term network saturation, only because it makes me think of the term market saturation and the idea of an excess to the point that it's rendered useless, which maybe isn't how I would think about the internet these days and its influence and spread, etc. So.
Right, yeah. No, I was with you until you said useless. So I feel like network saturation is, for those of us who are old enough to remember when the network wasn't saturating our lives, you know, there was this before and after. I feel like maybe the half generation after me is sort of the last, I don't know, it's always debated who were the last kids to grow up both without and with the internet. And I think that's a fundamental difference right there. So what network saturation means for, say, my 14-year-old nieces is going to be very different from how I, or someone who's older than I am, might think about how the internet is in our lives. I think for me, saturation means ubiquitousness. You know, we don't even think about it anymore. It's just there, and I think that's a condition that we need to look at closely instead of sort of forgetting about how information travels and how our information and data is circulating and traveling all the time and being used. I guess that's it.